Hi, guys. This is part three of Crete. Today begs a whole new exploration into what I call the M word. The M word, matriarchy. What is that? Is that like the opposite of the patriarchy? And why do we even have to talk about this? Hasn't the patriarchy always been there? No, it hasn't. There are ways of looking outside of structures and systems and values we take for granted today. So what we're going to talk about today is the largest island in the middle of the Aegean that was one of the Greek islands, Crete. 4,000 years ago, it was a powerhouse, right? They had three writing systems. One of them hasn't been deciphered yet. The second one, Linear B, is really early Greek, and you can kind of see the connection where maybe Athena started out in Crete, maybe Apollo started out in Crete, and then made their way over to mainland Greece, right? But this idea then of the patriarchy, what is the patriarchy? You're hearing this word. You might have heard it in the Barbie movie, right? They said it about 40 times. But it's a moment we like to look for in history. Oftentimes it's aligned with Indo-European migrations, and that is a cosmogony, a belief system that people had of a sky god that wielded lightning bolts, right? A god who throws lightning bolts from the sky, a one father kind of god, right? Thor, Yahweh, Zeus. You see this all over the place in Europe. You can see it all over the world. But one of the things I love so much about looking at Greek mythology, and I think one of the reasons why Greek mythology is so important and so loved and so malleable, right? Malleable, right? Look at Percy Jackson and Clash of the Titans and all these different ways that people like to Circe, Song of Achilles. People love to tell these old stories, right? Even today, right? They interpret them, right? Counter storytelling, right? So what's happened then? We look at this, perhaps they were Zeus's people, perhaps they were these horseback riding, sky god worshiping peoples that came over to this area in the Mediterranean. Could have been, right before the fall of the Bronze Age collapse, which brought in a dark ages. This is when they think the Trojan War was really fought around 1000 BC or so, right? And so this is a time where there was really no artistic output. This was a time there was no writings. So everything would have been oral traditions, songs, laments, storytelling. And it was Homer who then wrote down the Iliad and the Odyssey, but he might not have written it. He might have just written down the stories he had heard. So there's this bringing together then of around 800 BC, 500 BC, 400 BC, the golden age of Greece. And the ideas we have of goddesses and gods today are because of this commingling of Indo-European culture and the cultures that were already there. And this brings up the big questions on Crete and on the Greek mainland. Who were the cultures that were already there? It can be argued that they were matrifocal. What is that? Is that a matriarchy? Wait, how do you even tie that into anything? So what we're looking at this new language, this terminology, really important terminology, because what I believe and what I see in all of the evidence of scholars bringing all of their theories together is perhaps because of this dynamic of one culture merging with another. We are lucky that we still have vestiges of the goddesses that were there before this crash of cultures, or cultural appropriation, if you want to go there. Greek mythology is the right working out of these two cultures, the dynamic sky god, right, and the sun gods, the invading Indo-Europeans, with the older lunar agricultural systems of pre-Hellenic East, pre-Hellenic Greece, right? So just like when we studied, if you recall, we studied Apollo, right? The people that worshiped Apollo went to Delphi and they set up shop so you could communicate with this god via an oracle, via the priest who would interpret the oracle, right? The oracle of Delphi in the sanctuary of Apollo on mainland Greece, had already been an established oracle there, led probably by women, and they always used or had a woman who was the oracle. The voice of Apollo would come through. Something about when you look at ancient female powers and contributions and agency, that should be a moment in your mind where you say, aha, maybe there's something that existed there a long, long time ago. So now I'm going to take you on a slideshow, our last slideshow on Crete, because those folks in the Indo-European climates, they rode horses, and horses don't swim very well. So Crete shows kind of this last vestige of a flourishing culture where there is so much imagery related to women and no evidence of a warrior caste kingly system, which is a patriarchal system. So we're going to look at some arguments and some theories today. I know it's a lot, but it's also really important. So one of the things, someone who said this, someone in her book, Groeneweg and Frankfurt, in her book Arrest and Movement, talks about Cretan art in the second millennium, 4,000 years ago, is, what does she say here? Hang on. She says, here and here alone, in contrast to the Near East and Egypt, the human bid for timelessness was disregarded in the most complete acceptance of the grace of life and that the world had ever known. Life means movement, and the beauty of movement was woven into the intricate web of living forms we call scenes of nature. This is this book, by the way, right? So scenes of nature was revealed in human bodies acting out their serious games, inspired by a transcendence presence. So what that author is talking about is that all of the sacred nature of reality that the ancient world and agricultural culture knew was all demonstrative in the art we're about to see. Meaning it wasn't abstract. It wasn't, it wasn't linear. It was this beautiful description of the energy of nature in its cycle, by recognizing the imagery of the bull and the imagery of the goddess and the imagery of the bee. You are looking at aspects of nature that demonstrate energy as it contributes to the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. All right, let's take a look. So there is a lot of imagery related to, can you see that? Related to a goddess. See this? This is part of a fresco that was next to a big procession. And this is her big foot. It's alongside these other feet that are either red, symbolizing men, or smaller white feet, symbolizing mortal women. And this is a piece of the original that is now in the Heracleon Museum. I'm just going to show you this. This is also in the Heracleon Museum with our tour guide. You can kind of see this. See the walking. There are all these feet walking barefoot. See the skirt here. There's a and then see this, the anklets here, and this is the goddess and her foot. So this is the central part of the procession. That's what she's talking about. Here's a picture, also an original work that was found at Crete, at Knossos, at the temple of Knossos, that shows the goddess coming down from her heavenly home to the earth. Whenever you see a lady's hair like that, that's one of the ways they knew it was a goddess, because she's floating down. How cool is that? We've talked about bulls. We've talked about the labyrinth. We've talked about all these things that are found in Crete. This has a lot of controversy, because some people say, oh, it's a goddess, these are goddesses. Other people say, no, they're priestesses. And what's cool about it is some people say maybe they're dolls, okay, or maybe they're charms, but they were found in a repository in the throne room. The throne room would be a very important room, wouldn't you say? This handling of the snakes. This is the idea. Remember, snakes that shed their skin. When you look at agricultural societies, the snake is a more of a benign creature. When you look at more patriarchal societies, the snake becomes more suspect. So here we will see and see all the animals as ways of energy raising and then energy falling, or like the snake sheds its skin, it is something that is rebirthing itself. And I think we all humans do. So we're looking at these amazing concepts of metaphor, right? Amazing concepts of metaphor. This is something I want to show you really quickly too. This is a sarcophagus, and this shows here's men and women. And then on the side of it, they're probably preparing the funerary rites for the person who's on the inside who died. And on the side, it shows two women drawn by griffins, which they think is leading this person who's deceased to the other world. Okay, this is when it gets really interesting, and I won't keep you much longer. But we have to start to ask this question of what is a matriarchy? First and foremost, I don't think that, and we're looking mostly at ancient culture, right? I don't think a matriarchy is just the opposite of a patriarchy. A patriarchy has this social order of this God who rules from afar and has a structure that is very male dominated. That is not what they say a matriarchy is. I believe when we're really, coming down to brass tacks, we're looking at what are some of the concepts that go into female leadership. That's really all we're talking about, right? So the idea then, there's a woman named Cynthia Ellers. Her view about matriarchy is pretty ugly. So she actually talks about, here, I'll show you her book really quick. She talks about can you see that? The myth of the matriarchal prehistory. And I tend to agree with her, because part of what she's saying is that a matriarchy means that women invented agriculture. I could do a whole a whole other lecture series on why that may or may not be true. Goddess worship. Well, we see all over the world. If you look at some of the religions around the Indus Valley, you have thousands of goddesses, but it's still very much a gender oppressive state. Also, there's the argument of men's ignorance in conception, as in they don't know where babies come from. I think that's kind of infantilizing. Also, this is the big one. Peace prevailed in a prehistoric era. This is also something I'd like to do a different lecture on, but I do feel like there was no compilation of a machine of brutal gods. I think that there was more of to a lesser extent, the imagery that is lacking related to human sacrifice, related to violence, sexual assault, and all of that. Sure, there would have been fighting, but the idea of the machine and the construct and the normalization of war, I think that hadn't been invented yet. Different ways to look at that, right? And then the other big one is women dominating men. I don't think that a hierarchy was in place. I and other people like Mariah Gambudis, who is who was an archaeologist, and she was a Lithuanian archaeologist, The Living Goddess. She talks a lot about early agricultural societies being egalitarian, as in men and women on equal footing. And that is something that I think that I want us to look more and more into. There's another woman who talks about the creation of the patriarchy, Gerda Lerner. And she talks about there is no looking at, shoot, what did I have here? Female subordination is not universal. That's what she says. She says goddess worship does not equal a matriarchy. She also thinks that there are alternate models that might have existed before the patriarchy, and it's important for us to try to understand them, because rather than oppressive systems, if there are other systems at work that are egalitarian, we should see what that looks like, right? So that's one idea about trying to break down what a matriarchy is and what the arguments are for and against it. Okay, so what does women's power look like? If we're talking about women leadership, right? We're talking about a concept called matra something. So matriarchy would be something where women dominated men, if that existed, but we don't really have any any evidence of that in the ancient world. Mother goddess, yes, but just because we have a mother goddess doesn't necessarily mean that women were the leaders. Matrilineal, yes. See, there is some evidence that matrilineal, as in, taking on the mother's name, living with the mother, passing on through the mother's line, may have existed, and we even see that today in some societies. Matrifocal, that's the term I use to talk about the earlier tribes that were in Greece prior to the Indo-European changes. And then egalitarian, another word that scholars use. So this is the last slide I want to show you, which is so cool. And that is in the Kenosis Palace. We've looked at the palace now, right? The throne room, what they found was the throne was moved during the solstices and during the equinoxes. So for instance, the throne might be set here at the winter solstice, so that when the winter sun rises, it shines directly on the priestess sitting on that throne. Same for midsummer. So we are actually talking about evidence of a sun, S-U-N, cult that existed, that was women centered and that were women led spiritual ceremonies. Again, recall, this temple was not a place where you had all of the show and distribution of power with one elite set. You had, it looked like everyone was well taken care of, and that this idea of the sun rising, lighting up wherever that throne set 3 or 4 times a year was a way to demonstrate power of the divine in the immediate, in the corporal setting of priestess in her super chair. Okay, that's enough for right now, but I think you probably got a gist of why it's so much to take on the idea of matriarchy. We're at a place where we can all agree. You see these different pantheons around the world where you have one head captain at the helm who's a male god, right? Like Thor, like Zeus. And then you also have, and you have lots of goddesses, but they're oftentimes mothers, sisters, wives, hero impersonators or women helpers. That's because we're looking at these stories through patriarchal values or through the hero cult lens, right? That's part of a patriarchal structure. What else is there? Perhaps Hera was the goddess of the mountaintop all on her own, right? And earliest stories, even if you read the Iliad with Homer, the earliest tales of Hera and Zeus were not of them fighting. It is in each other's arms they walked, and upsprang flowers in the grass every place they went. Like it was a love story between them. So it's interesting. Maybe there has been, this story's change, right? We saw that with Medusa. We saw that with Apollo. What were the earliest stories? That's what I'm always hungry for. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the Crete unit. Take care.